Philadelphia, almost midnight. Rain. Lucas Bennett had $11 until Friday and 2 kids to feed. He was walking home from his dock shift when he saw her. A woman alone under a bus shelter, soaked through, shaking so hard he could see it from across the street. 3 people walked past. He stopped. He ran the numbers. Same numbers he always ran. $11. 2 kids. 3 days until payday. He walked into the corner store anyway. He came out with 1 cup of hot soup and the jacket off his back and held them both out to her. She looked at him carefully. "What if you're helping the wrong person?" "Maybe I am," he said. "But at least tonight I didn't walk past someone who needed help." She opened her mouth to respond. 3 black SUVs hit the curb hard. Men in suits poured out, surrounding her, calling her name. Lucas's phone rang at the same moment. Sinclair Memorial Hospital. He ran. 40 minutes later, soaking wet in a hospital corridor, a doctor pulled him aside and told him the woman he'd given his jacket to had founded this building and personally approved which surgeries got prioritized. At the end of that hallway, his 11-year-old son had been waiting 3 weeks for exactly that decision. Philadelphia. A man running on 4 hours of sleep and stubborn love. 7 years of it. Lucas Bennett had been the kind of man who fixed things with zip ties and didn't mention it. He'd been that way since Sarah died. Stomach cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the last morning. And he'd raised Mason the way she would have wanted. Honestly, when he could manage it. And quietly, when he couldn't. Mason was 11 now. He had his mother's eyes and his father's habit of calling things fine when they weren't. The loading dock at Penn's Landing Fish Market ran midnight to 7. Lucas slept until noon on good days, then picked up food delivery shifts until Mason got home from school. He had a neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, 4 doors down, who collected Mason from the bus stop on the nights Lucas was still sleeping, and never once mentioned it as a favor. And between the 2 of them, the schedule held. It left gaps. Enough to sit with his son each evening, help with homework, watch 1/4 of whatever baseball game was on before his eyes gave out. Enough, barely, to feel like a father instead of a man treading water while pretending to swim. Mason's heart condition had a formal name that Lucas had looked up in the hospital library the day after diagnosis. Moderate risk. Manageable with medication. Surgical intervention likely required within 5 to 8 years. That window had been closing for 3 years now. The medication kept the numbers stable enough that the doctors said, "Not yet," then soon, then very soon. And Lucas kept paying the installments on what the insurance didn't cover, which was most of it, and he kept showing up for the next shift. He was 3 months behind on the installments. He'd been behind before. He always caught up. 2 miles north, in a building she built and is slowly losing, the woman who will change everything is trying to remember why she started. Vivian Sinclair had become a nurse because 3 children died in 1 ER shift in 1979, and nobody seemed to think the system was the problem. She had spent 40 years building something she believed could be different. A network that treated people before asking about coverage, that kept the lights on through efficiency rather than exclusion. Sinclair Medical Network now ran 11 hospitals across Pennsylvania and New Jersey. It also had a board of directors who measured success in occupancy rates, a CFO who had never set foot in an ICU, and a CEO, her nephew Adrian, who had quietly replaced the word patients in internal memos with the word clients, and seemed to believe nobody would notice. Adrian was 41, lean, and had the particular polish of a man who had never had a conversation he wasn't controlling. He operated through process, through directives and authorization codes and administrative language that was technically accurate and practically a closed door. He had been doing it for 3 years, and Vivian had been watching and arguing and losing votes. And lately she had begun to feel that she was losing the capacity to be surprised by any of it. The board meeting that evening had run 4 hours. The proposal? Reclassify 42% of subsidized care beds as premium units. Vivian had argued against it with data and precedent and the controlled fury that takes decades to learn. She'd lost the vote 8-4. Afterward, she told her driver to stop 2 blocks from the hospital. "I need to walk," she said. "Don't follow me. Give me 40 minutes." Her security team was not pleased. She got out anyway and told them she would call if she needed them, which she had no intention of doing. She had been walking for 20 minutes, not really seeing the street, thinking about the vote and the 3 faces that had looked away when it was called, when the rain started. She made the Callow Hill shelter before her blouse was fully soaked and stood there with her arms around herself, thinking nothing useful, until a man in a thermal undershirt came out of a convenience store holding a cup of soup and his only jacket. Her security team found her 11 minutes later, having tracked her phone signal when she failed to call. They arrived to find her standing in the shelter, dry enough, holding a cup of soup that wasn't hers to begin with. Across the city, a boy has been hiding something from his father for weeks. Mason Bennett had known something was wrong. Not the ordinary wrong he'd lived with whole life, the dull, offbeat percussion of a heart that didn't keep perfect time. This was sharper. Dizziness during gym class that he managed by slowing down before anyone noticed. Chest tightness on the stairs that he covered by stopping to check his phone. He didn't tell Lucas because he knew what happened to his father's face when the hospital called. That brief dimming, just a second, before the mask went back on and Lucas said, "We'll figure it out." Mason was 11, not stupid. He'd been doing his own version of the math for a long time. He had made it through 2.5 laps of the Thursday morning fitness test before his vision went white at the edges. His PE teacher caught him before he hit the floor. By the time the school nurse called Mrs. Okafor, Lucas was 3 hours into his sleep after the night shift. Mason was already in the ambulance. Mrs. Okafor was the one who drove to the hospital and sat with Mason until Lucas arrived, which she also never mentioned as a favor. By the time Lucas arrived at Sinclair Memorial that Thursday afternoon, Mason was sedated and surrounded by equipment that beeped in careful rhythms. Dr. Osei, tired eyes, direct manner, the cardiologist who had been tracking Mason's case for 3 years, sat Lucas down in a family consultation room and told him clearly, the deterioration had accelerated beyond the last imaging. Mason needed a cardiac transplant. The window was 72 hours. Lucas nodded. His hands were flat on his thighs. Dr. Osei continued, "The financial clearance team will need to speak with you before we can formally initiate the transplant process. I want to be honest with you. I don't control that part of the process. I wish I did." "How much?" She slid a form across the table. The number at the top was $104,000. Lucas looked at it for a moment. He folded it and put it in his pocket. "Who do I talk to?" he said. She gave him Adrian Sinclair's name. Adrian received Lucas in his 8th-floor office, real wood desk, city view, and listened with the practiced attentiveness of a man who was very good at seeming present. He explained the medical loan program, 12-year repayment, variable interest, words like structured and flexible that meant neither thing. "If it was your kid," Lucas said, "what would you do?" Adrian's smile didn't waver. He leaned back just slightly. "I'd make sure my family had comprehensive coverage in place before a situation like this arose. These products exist to help families in difficult positions." "That's not what I asked." A silence. The smile thinned by 1 millimeter. "Mr. Bennett, this hospital has obligations to its staff, its shareholders, its standards. What we can offer is the most favorable financing structure available." Lucas stood up. "Thank you for your time." He took the elevator down, stood in the atrium looking up through the glass at the dark executive floor, then walked to the corridor near Mason's room and sat down on the floor with his back against the wall. He had a notebook in his jacket pocket, a small spiral one, soft cover, that he'd been carrying for 3 years. In it, in his careful handwriting, were the dates and names of every call he'd made to this hospital, every still waiting on verification, every will be in touch. 41 entries. He opened it to the first blank page and didn't write anything, just held it. He did not sleep. The morning after. While Lucas keeps watch in the corridor below, something is moving on the floor above him. Vivian arrived at 7:15. She had slept 3 hours. She wore her own clothes now, her professional composure, but the man from the bus shelter was still in her head, specifically the way he had looked at the numbers and folded the paper into his pocket with the steadiness of someone who had already been through this calculation 100 times before. She didn't know that yet, but she was thinking about him. She asked her assistant for the previous night's admission records, then paused. Actually, the night shift admissions. Pediatric and cardiac specifically. Last 48 hours. 11 names. Not 63. She found it in 4 minutes. Bennett, Mason, age 11, cardiac. She read the full file in her office with the door closed. 3 years of records. Payment installments, never more than a few days late, on a dock worker's income. Dr. Osei's notation from 8 months ago flagging Mason for surgical evaluation. A follow-up 6 months ago. Priority tier reassignment, pending insurance review. And then, 5 months ago, a single line that made her set down her coffee cup. Surgical slot reallocated per administrative directive AD-2024-11. She knew that directive. She had argued against it in the meeting where it passed, and lost. She pulled up the case that had received Mason's slot. Patient, 12-year-old male, father, Gerald Whitmore. She recognized the name immediately from the donor ledger, a $3.2 million naming gift to the new cardiology wing, announced at a gala she had attended and not enjoyed. She sat with that for a moment. The full shape of it, the deliberateness of it. Then she called Dr. Reyes, head of transplant surgery, a man she had hired 12 years ago and trusted completely, and told him to come to her office. She told her assistant to hold everything else. Reyes arrived carrying a folder he had been holding for 2 months, waiting for someone with the standing to ask. He set it on her desk with the steadiness of a man who had rehearsed this moment. The pattern wasn't limited to Mason. Over 14 months, at least 6 surgical slots had been quietly reallocated, from patients with lower-tier insurance or no institutional connections to those with premium plans or donor relationships. Each was papered over with the same administrative language. Each bore the same initials. "Why didn't you bring this to me sooner?" Vivian asked. Reyes met her eyes. "Because 6 months ago, I wasn't sure you still had the authority to do anything with it." She didn't answer that. He wasn't wrong, and both of them knew it. She picked up her phone. "I do now." Within the hour, she had submitted an urgent request to the Regional Organ Procurement Network on Mason's behalf, setting in motion a search that would run parallel to everything else happening in the building. She had also called her financial advisor. Neither conversation was long. She knew what she was asking for. In the corridor below, Lucas reaches the point where the math stops working in every direction. By mid-morning, Lucas had been awake for 20 hours. He'd called his landlord back, the 3rd missed call, and listened to the voicemail about the end-of-month deadline without feeling much. He'd checked his bank account once and closed the app. He sat with Mason during the short windows the boy was awake. During one of them, Mason looked at him directly and asked, "Is it expensive?" "Don't worry about that." "Dad." Lucas met his son's eyes, his mother's directness looking back at him from a hospital bed. "We're handling it," Lucas said. Mason nodded slowly. He never looked convinced when Lucas said that. He'd just always been kind enough not to say so. By noon, Lucas had called 3 medical lending companies. The first needed collateral he didn't have. The second had a processing time of 5 to 7 business days. The third didn't answer. He got transfer paperwork from the administrative desk and carried it back to his spot in the corridor, the section of floor near the stairwell where the fluorescent light didn't flicker. He sat down, back against the wall, and started filling out the form for St. Ignatius Public Hospital. Lower transplant success rates, longer wait times, but no $104,000 up front, and he had run out of other directions. He was halfway through the second page when footsteps stopped in front of him. Vivian Sinclair stood in the corridor, looking at the papers in his hands. She had come down specifically to find him, a man matching his description on the pediatric cardiac floor, the nurse at the station had said, been there since last night. She sat down in the low visitor's chair along the wall across from him, close enough to speak quietly, and she looked at him the way she had looked at him from the bus shelter, without performance, just attention. "I read your son's file this morning," she said. Lucas looked at her. Really looked, for the first time since the shelter. The pale blouse was gone, replaced by a suit, but the eyes were the same, alert, taking things in without performing the taking in. "You remember me," he said. "I remember what you said. I also remember that you didn't tell me your name. I want you to know how I found you. I asked for pediatric cardiac admissions from the last 2 days. 11 names. Your son's case matched what I was already looking into." Lucas nodded once. He appreciated that she'd explained it. "I need to tell you something about his case," she said. She told him without softening it. The surgical slot. The 5-month delay. The donor's son who had taken Mason's place on the priority list. The administrative language that was accurate on paper and a lie in practice. When she finished, Lucas was quiet. Then, "He qualified." 5 months ago. "Yes. And nobody told me. They told you it was pending insurance review. Every time you called, and I saw from your file that you called every 6 weeks, you were given the same answer. Awaiting additional verification. It's the kind of response you can't disprove without access to records you're not supposed to see." Lucas looked at the transfer form in his hands. He thought about the notebook in his jacket pocket, the 41 entries. He had believed the answers because there was no available reason not to. "I kept paying," he said. Not with anger, with the flat steadiness of someone reporting a fact that has just become heavier than it was a minute ago. "I know," Vivian said. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she told him about her daughter. Not everything, but enough. A private hospital in 1997, a girl of 19 with a treatable condition. An insurance gap nobody caught in time. The long, strange aftermath in which Vivian had decided that building something was the only response she could stand. "And instead," she said, "I built something that does the same thing with better paperwork." Lucas looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know why I'm doing what I'm doing." She held his gaze. "And because last night you looked at a stranger in the rain and you made a decision that cost you something real. You knew what the numbers said. You went into that store anyway." She let that sit. "I've been in rooms full of intelligent people arguing about healthcare ethics for a long time," she said. "Nobody ever put it the way you did." Lucas said nothing. "What did you mean?" she asked. "When you said at least tonight you didn't walk past anyone." He thought about it for a moment. "I meant that's all I had. I couldn't fix whatever was wrong for her. I couldn't fix the rain. I just didn't want to be someone who kept walking." Vivian nodded slowly. She understood that perfectly. That evening, the moment that turns deliberation into action. At 6 p.m., Lucas was back on the floor in the corridor, the transfer form face down on his knee, untouched for 2 hours. He had not eaten. The food he'd brought, a sandwich from the vending machine, he had noticed an older man 2 chairs down staring at the middle distance, with the specific blankness of someone who had been sitting with hunger long enough that it had become background noise. Without deciding, Lucas had walked over, set the sandwich beside him, and returned to his spot. He didn't think about it afterward. It wasn't the kind of thing he thought about. Vivian, coming out of the stairwell at the far end of the corridor, saw it. She had already made her decision. She had made it that morning in her office, when she read the file. But watching Lucas set that sandwich down and return to the wall without any trace of self-consciousness, as if giving away the only food he had were simply a thing you did when you had it and someone else didn't, she felt something she hadn't felt in a while. Not admiration exactly, something quieter than that, like recognizing a word in a language you'd almost forgotten. She turned back toward the stairwell, found a quiet alcove near the nurse's station, and made 2 calls. She told the procurement network to escalate Mason's case to urgent status. She told her financial advisor to begin liquidating a specific block of personal holdings. Neither call was long. She had stopped needing to think about whether to make them. That night, the wall comes down. At 8 p.m., Mason was awake. Lucas was beside him, holding a magazine he hadn't read a word of. "Dad?" "Yeah." Mason's voice was rough, and he paused twice in the middle, working around the effort of it. "I heard you on the phone with Mr. Keller last night, the landlord. I was supposed to be asleep." Lucas set the magazine down. "I don't want you to spend your whole life in debt." "Because of me. Mom wouldn't want that either." Lucas put his elbows on his knees. He pressed his face into his hands and stayed there, not performing anything, just holding still, with something that had been building for a long time and had finally run out of room. When he looked up, he didn't try to fix his expression. "Your job is to stay here," he said. His voice was unsteady, and he didn't apologize for it. "That's the whole job. Everything else is mine. Can you do that?" Mason looked at him for a long moment. The monitor beeped its slow, steady rhythm. "Yeah," Mason said. "I can do that." Lucas reached over and covered his son's hand with his own. Mason turned his palm up and held on, carefully, the grip of someone who had learned to be economical with his strength. But he held on. They didn't say anything else for a long time. The call comes. Everything narrows to one direction. Reyes called at 10:30 that night. A compatible heart had been identified through the regional network, the result of Vivian's urgent escalation submitted that morning. The viability window was narrow. If they were going to act, it had to be tonight. Lucas stood in the hallway outside Mason's room, one hand braced against the wall, and listened to Reyes explain the procedure with the careful clarity of a surgeon who respects the person he's talking to. "You're the one doing this?" Lucas asked. "You've done this before?" "Yes," Reyes said. "Many times. I want you to feel confident about that. Will he feel any pain during the operation?" "He'll be under general anesthesia. He won't feel anything." "Okay," Lucas said. "Let's do it." He went back in and sat on the edge of Mason's bed while the nurses began prepping him for transport. Mason was quieter than usual, which Lucas had learned over 11 years meant scared and trying not to show it, the same way his father was. "Hey," Lucas said. "You know what I've been thinking about? That time you tried to teach yourself to juggle using my work gloves." Mason's expression shifted slightly. "I got to 3. You got to 2. The third one hit the lamp. It grazed the lamp. The lamp has a very different memory of that event." That got him. A real smile, brief and tired and entirely his mother's. Lucas had to look at the ceiling for a second. "When I wake up," Mason said, "can we get actual food? Not the Jell-O. The Jell-O is a punishment." "Whatever you want." "Cheesesteaks." "Done." 2. "Let's see how the surgery goes first." Mason almost smiled again. The nurses moved in. Lucas stepped back and watched them wheel his son down the corridor. The blue gown, the equipment rolling alongside, Mason's hand resting open on the blanket like he'd just set something down and would pick it up again later. They took him through the OR doors at 11:15. Lucas stood watching until the doors stopped moving. Upstairs, Adrian makes his move and discovers the limits of operating without a conscience. The emergency board meeting convened at midnight. Adrian had spent the evening building his case with the methodical precision he brought to everything. The charge against Vivian was clean, documentable, and should have been sufficient. He had the votes mapped. He had the outcome mapped. He had, he believed, covered everything. He had not calculated for what Vivian brought into the room. She walked in at 12:07 a.m. and set a folder on the table without sitting. She distributed copies to each board member without explanation, then stood and waited while they read. The document was 8 pages. It laid out 14 months of surgical slot reallocations at Sinclair Memorial, cross-referenced against donor contribution records and insurance tier classifications. The language was precise. The sourcing was internal. It required no interpretation. On the last page, a single footnote noted that copies had been submitted to the Pennsylvania Department of Health, and that 2 journalists covering healthcare regulation had agreed to hold publication for 24 hours pending the board's response. Vivian sat down. Adrian looked at her across the table. His expression held. He was very good at that. Below the surface, things were moving quickly. She could see it in the way he set his pen down a half-second too carefully. "This is a distraction from the procedural matter at hand," he said. "Then let's address the procedural matter." The vote on her removal was called 6-6. 3 members who had been in Adrian's column that afternoon had shifted. The motion failed. The board chair announced the result in a voice carefully empty of inflection. Adrian looked at his aunt. She looked back at him with the steadiness of someone who had made peace with losing things and discovered, in doing so, that she had become much harder to threaten. He had built his power on other people's fear of consequences. She had stopped fearing them somewhere in the past 24 hours, and he had no strategy for that. The meeting adjourned at 1:40 a.m. The corridor. 9 hours. The particular work of learning to wait. Lucas spent the night in the OR hallway, in one of the plastic chairs bolted to the floor, the second from the left, for no reason he could have named. He sat with his hands between his knees and let time do what it was going to do. Around 2 in the morning, a nurse brought him coffee he hadn't asked for. He thanked her and held the cup until it went cold, then kept holding it, because putting it down felt like a decision he wasn't ready to make. Around 4, he thought about Sarah. Not the end of it, but the early years. The apartment on Lombard Street, with the radiator that knocked every morning at 6. The way she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them. She had always known how to be still when stillness was what a situation needed. He had learned it from watching her. He thought that maybe that was one of the things she had meant to leave him. He took the notebook out of his jacket pocket. 41 entries. He read through each one, all the dates, all the names, all the still waiting on verification. And when he got to the last page, he closed it and held it the same way he'd been holding the coffee cup. Around 6, gray morning light began showing through the window at the far end of the corridor. He watched the glass change from black to dark blue to something almost silver. He was watching it when he realized he'd been asleep without knowing it. At 8:43 a.m., the OR doors opened. Reyes walked down the corridor toward him. Lucas was already standing. He didn't remember getting up. Reyes stopped, looked at him for a moment, the kind of look that comes before words because the words need a runway. Then he nodded. Lucas closed his eyes. He kept them closed for a long time. The room where the only thing that matters has already happened. The recovery room was very quiet. Everything beeped softly. The light had the same pale gray quality as the corridor window earlier, the particular color of mourning after a long night. Mason's eyes opened slowly, moved across the ceiling, found the equipment, found his father. Lucas was in the chair beside the bed. Yesterday's clothes, unshaven, one elbow resting on the bed rail. He was looking at his son with nothing managed in his expression at all. Mason's voice was barely there, rough from the breathing tube. "You're still here." Lucas covered Mason's hand with his. "Yeah," he said. "I'm here." Mason's eyes drifted closed. His grip tightened slowly around his father's fingers, careful, deliberate, the grip of someone who has decided to hold on. A nurse came to check the monitors, glanced at the two of them, and left without a word. Some moments don't need witnesses to be real. Adrian Sinclair was suspended from the CEO role pending formal investigation. The Pennsylvania Department of Health opened inquiries at Sinclair Memorial and 2 affiliated facilities. 4 additional families were identified whose care timelines had been affected by the same pattern of administrative redirection. Their cases were reviewed. 3 received revised treatment plans within 30 days. Vivian took interim executive control. She reinstated the full financial assistance fund on her first day back. She commissioned an independent audit of 3 years of surgical records. She held a staff meeting and spoke for 11 minutes without notes, and several nurses who had worked in the building since it opened said afterward that it was the first time in years the hospital had sounded like itself again. She didn't hold a press conference. She went back to work. The jacket. 5 days later, when Mason had been moved to a regular room and was eating hospital jello with the focused displeasure of someone who had decided to have opinions again, Vivian's assistant called and asked if Lucas would come by the executive floor. No urgency, whenever he was ready. He went that afternoon. The office was large and quiet, afternoon light coming through east-facing windows at a low angle. Vivian stood when he came in, and he saw it immediately. His jacket hanging from a wooden coat rack near the window. Laundered, pressed, the fraying left cuff neatly mended, as if someone had taken real time with it. It looked honest and out of place among the expensive fixtures of the room, like a working tool left in a gallery. Lucas crossed to it and touched the sleeve without speaking. "I had it cleaned," Vivian said, "and repaired. I couldn't return it at the hospital. I didn't think you'd accept it that way." "I almost bought a new one last winter," Lucas said. "Talked myself out of it. Practical." "Broke," he said, and she made a quiet sound. An actual laugh, small and quick, like it surprised her. He turned to face her. "The board didn't remove you." "No." "What happens now?" "The Department of Health inquiry is formal and moving quickly. Adrian has been suspended. The families whose care was affected are being reviewed individually. It won't undo the time they lost, but the hospital will make it right in every way it still can." She said it evenly, as fact. "What happens now to this institution is that it goes back to doing what it was built to do. That's the only outcome I'm interested in." Lucas was quiet for a moment. He was turning his jacket in his hands, looking at the mended cuff. "Why were you out there that night? By yourself, in the rain?" "I needed to walk after the vote. I told my team to give me 40 minutes. I had stopped expecting the next hour to be any different from the last one. I do that sometimes, when I've been losing long enough." He nodded. He recognized that kind of night. "I need to ask you something," she said. She picked up an envelope from her desk. "I'd like to offer you a position. Family Support Coordinator. You'd work directly with patients' families navigating financial and administrative barriers, finding what's available to them, explaining what's actually happening with their cases, making sure no one spends 5 months being handed the same answer without understanding why." She paused. "You'd be paid properly. Benefits included. I'd make sure of that personally." Lucas looked at the envelope. "Why me?" "Because you know what it costs," she said. "Not in dollars. And because 3 years ago you started a notebook." She glanced at his jacket pocket. And you wrote down every single call, every date, and every name. That's not what someone in despair does. That's what someone systematic does. Someone who doesn't give up and knows how to pay attention. He looked down at the jacket pocket for a moment, then back at her. Mason told me something a few months ago, he said, that he wants to be a doctor someday. I half heard it at the time. I didn't take it the way I should have. Take it seriously, Vivian said. He's 11. He's 11, and he spent 3 years monitoring his own cardiac symptoms without telling his father because he didn't want to worry him. That's not a child. That's someone who pays attention to things. She met his gaze. Take it seriously. Lucas stood there a moment, the jacket over one arm and the envelope in his hand. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. That night at the shelter, when you asked, what if you're helping the wrong person? What did you mean? She considered that for a moment. I think I meant, what if I'm not worth it? What if the calculation doesn't come out in my favor? A pause. I'd been in that meeting for 4 hours. I'd lost a vote I believed in. I was standing in the rain, thinking I might have spent 40 years building the wrong thing. And then a stranger gave you soup. And then a stranger gave me soup, she said, and didn't ask anything about me first. And I thought... She stopped. What? I thought maybe that's the only calculation that ever actually held. She looked at him steadily. Not whether someone deserves it, just, is there someone who needs it? And can I do something about it right now? Lucas put on the jacket. It fit the same as it always had. The mended cuff was neat and solid, a repair done properly. He looked at it for a moment. I'll read the offer, he said. That's all I'm asking. He went back down to Mason's room. His son was awake, watching baseball with the sound too low, and when Lucas came in, Mason looked at the jacket and said, You got it back. She had it cleaned. The hospital lady? Her name is Vivian Sinclair. She founded this hospital. Mason considered this. Is she why we're still here, instead of the other place? Lucas sat down beside the bed. Yeah, she is. Mason looked at the baseball game for a moment. Then, we should probably thank her. I did. I mean, properly. He glanced at his father. Mom always said you did thank yous wrong, too short. Your mother was not wrong about that. So I should write a letter. When you're stronger. I'm stronger now. You had heart surgery 4 days ago. I could probably manage a letter, Mason said, with the precise tone of someone who has decided to have this argument and expects to win it eventually. Lucas looked at him. The determination in it, the life in it, the entirely unreasonable stubbornness of a kid who had just come through something that should have scared the opinions right out of him, and instead had seemed to produce more of them. He thought, Sarah would have loved this moment. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. He just sat with his son and watched 3 innings of a game neither of them knew the score of, and it was enough. Philadelphia, 1 year later. November again. The city was doing what Philadelphia does in November, making itself hard to love, gray and damp, smelling of old leaves and coffee from the corner shops that keep the door open anyway. Lucas and Mason walked along Callowhill Street with their hands in their pockets, headed nowhere in particular, which Mason had recently decided was his preferred kind of walk. He walked steadily now, with the unconscious ease of someone no longer tracking his own breathing. He had started Saturday morning basketball with the kids from the next block, and came home sweaty and arguing about calls, with energy to spare, delighted about it in the particular way of someone who has not always had it to spare and has not yet forgotten what the other way felt like. Lucas was 6 months into the coordinator role. He had a desk and a proper chair, and a phone that rang with calls from families who were being told to wait, and he knew every administrative mechanism in the building well enough to find the ones that moved and the ones that were just there to look like movement. The notebook, the spiral one with the soft cover, 41 entries, sat on his desk as a kind of reference. Not because he needed it anymore, because it reminded him what the view looked like from the floor of the corridor, which was useful information for someone whose job was to help people who were sitting there right now. They were passing the bus shelter, the same one, same narrow roof, same bench, when Lucas slowed. A man sat inside, older, in a coat not quite thick enough for the temperature. A plastic bag sat folded carefully on his lap. He was looking at the middle distance with the stillness of someone who has stopped expecting the next hour to be different from this one. Lucas had 2 coffees. He'd bought an extra at the corner shop 3 blocks back, as he had most days now. He walked into the shelter and set the extra cup on the bench beside the man. The man looked up at him. "Cold out," Lucas said. "Yeah," the man said. "It is." Lucas nodded once and walked back out. Mason fell into step beside him. They walked half a block in silence. "Mom would have done that," Mason said. "Yeah." Lucas glanced at his son. "She also would have stopped and talked for 45 minutes. At least. Found out his whole life story. Probably given him our phone number." Mason smiled, easy and unguarded, nothing careful in it. "That does sound like her." They walked on. The rain that had been threatening all day held off a little longer. Mason reached up and pushed his hood down, letting the cold air settle on his face. Because he could. Because his body did what he asked it to now, and he wasn't quite used to that yet, and he didn't want to get too used to it too fast. Lucas noticed. He said nothing. Some things you just walk beside. "Wow, what an incredible journey we just went on together. First of all, I want to take a moment to say a massive thank you to everyone who stayed until the very end of this story. Thank you for listening, for engaging, and for sharing your time with me today. Stories like this, stories about quiet dignity, misplaced authority, and the unbreakable bond between a parent and a child, really resonate with us because they touch on the very core of what it means to be human in a corporate world. If you are just letting the dust settle from that incredible ending at the spelling bee, grab a cup of coffee or tea, sit back, and let's unpack everything that just happened. We are going to dive deep into a summary of the events, analyze the profound lessons hidden within the narrative, and discuss why Julian Vance is the exact type of leader the world needs more of right now. Let's quickly recap the brilliant sequence of events that just unfolded. Our story opens in a high-stakes, tense corporate boardroom. Eleanor Price, a newly hired numbers-obsessed COO, is preparing for a massive presentation with the Apex delegation. In the back of the room sits Julian, a seemingly ordinary junior data analyst. But Julian is wearing something extraordinary, a cheap pink rhinestone butterfly clip on his lapel. To Eleanor, this is a violation of her strict, optics-driven version of professionalism. She publicly fires him on the spot. Julian doesn't yell. He doesn't argue. He simply touches the clip, a promise to his daughter, and walks out in silence. But here is the twist that Eleanor didn't know. Julian Vance isn't just an analyst. He is the founding shareholder, the creator of the company's core architecture, and the chairman of the board. He built the company from his kitchen 7 years ago. So why was he working as a junior analyst? Following the tragic passing of his wife 3 years prior, Julian willingly stepped down from his executive duties to ensure he could leave work at 6 every evening to raise his young daughter, Maya. The butterfly clip was her mother's, and Maya pinned it on him that morning so they could be brave at the same time for her spelling bee. The climax hits when the Apex delegation arrives. Eleanor tries to launch the demo, but the system locks her out because HR terminated Julian's account, and the system's security protocol automatically froze everything tied to the foundational architecture which Julian wrote. When Eleanor orders Thomas, a hard-working junior employee whom Julian had quietly mentored late at night, to bypass the system, Thomas reveals the truth to the room. He tells them exactly who Julian is. Eleanor, realizing her mistake, tries to spin the narrative, accusing Julian of being manipulative by hiding his identity, and tries to rally the employees against him. Instead, Thomas stands up, places his badge on the table, and quits. He is quickly followed by several others. They don't care about Julian's hidden wealth. They care that Julian was the man who stayed with them until 2 in the morning to fix code when no one else would. Julian returns, unlocks the system, and pulls up data proving that Eleanor's management style was toxic, rewarding sycophants while punishing actual hard workers. The CFO confirms Eleanor had no legal authority to fire Julian. In 4 swift sentences, Julian terminates Eleanor for cause. He saves the Apex deal, promotes Thomas, and leaves to do the most important thing on his schedule: watch his daughter win her spelling bee, with the pink butterfly clip still proudly pinned to his lapel. There is so much to learn from this narrative. We see a stark contrast in leadership styles. Eleanor represents a very common, toxic form of modern management. She cares about the appearance of professionalism over the substance of the work. To her, a pink hair clip was a threat to the company's image. She measured success by who agreed with her and who looked the part. Julian, on the other hand, represents true leadership. Leadership isn't a title, it's an action. Julian was a leader when he was the CEO, but he was equally a leader when he sat down next to a struggling junior employee in the middle of the night to help debug a system. True leaders remove friction for their teams. They don't create it. This story also highlights the danger of assumptions and ego. Eleanor made a fatal mistake. She didn't ask questions about people she deemed irrelevant. Because Julian had no fancy title on his door and didn't boast about his wealth, she assumed he had no power. She let her ego blind her to reality. Never judge a person's value by their title, their office size, or their quiet demeanor. The most dangerous person in the room is rarely the loudest. It is usually the one who is quietly collecting data, watching, and understanding how everything works from the ground up. Think about the most powerful moment in the boardroom. It wasn't when the CFO revealed Julian's legal status. The most powerful moment was when Thomas put his badge on the table, followed by Priya, and then the others. Why did they resign for a man they thought was just a junior analyst? Because Julian gave them his time, his empathy, and his respect when they were struggling. When you treat people like human beings, you build a foundation of loyalty that no corporate hierarchy can break. Ultimately, Julian's story is about knowing what truly matters. He built a multi-million-dollar empire, yet he realized that none of it mattered if he couldn't be there for his little girl. Stepping down from being CEO to be a present father was the ultimate display of strength. In a culture that glorifies the hustle and working endless hours, Julian's choice reminds us that our jobs will never love us back. The only people who will remember that you worked late are your kids. Julian wore a plastic pink butterfly clip into a room of executives because keeping a promise to a scared 7-year-old was infinitely more important than the opinions of people in gray suits. As we wrap up today's video, I want to leave you with this thought. Are you an Eleanor, caught up in the optics and the ego? Or are you a Julian, quietly doing the work, supporting the people around you, and remembering what actually matters when you go home at the end of the day? I hope this story inspired you as much as it inspired me. We need more butterfly clips in the boardroom. We need more empathy in our workplaces. And we need to remember that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who built the whole building. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about your own career, your family, or how you treat your coworkers, please do me a huge favor. Hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow and pushes these positive, meaningful stories out to more people who might really need to hear them today. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We have so many more incredible stories and deep dives coming your way. and I don't want you to miss a single one. Before you go, drop a comment down below. I want to hear from you. What was your absolute favorite moment in this story? Was it Thomas putting his badge on the table? Was it the Apex director signing the deal? Or was it Maya adjusting the clip at the spelling bee? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you all again from the bottom of my heart for spending your time with me today. Keep working hard, keep supporting the people around you, and never be afraid to wear your own pink butterfly clip. I'll see you in the next video.